In February 1945, as Nazi Germany's defeat approached, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill met for the last time at the Yalta Conference to shape the post-war world. Though victory seemed certain, three major questions about the future remained unresolved. However, Roosevelt would die months later, Churchill soon lost office, and only Stalin remained in power after the war. The first major issue was Eastern Europe's future. With Soviet forces occupying much of the region, the Allies had to decide whether liberated nations would enjoy self-determination or fall under Moscow's influence. The second dilemma concerned Germany's future. The Allies had to decide whether a defeated Germany should be permanently weakened to prevent another war or rebuilt to help restore stability in Europe. Finally, the conference addressed global peace and security. To prevent future conflicts, the Allies laid the groundwork for a new international organization, the United Nations. These were not just policy debates, they reflected deep divisions over ideology, security, and trust. As wartime unity faded, disagreements over these issues helped spark the Cold War, marked by suspicion, division, and decades of tension between former allies. On paper, the Yalta agreements offered hope for Eastern Europe. Stalin pledged to allow free elections in the newly liberated countries, but those promises were soon broken as Soviet-backed governments tightened control across the region. The Western Allies faced a harsh reality. While they had diplomatic influence, the Soviet Union had troops on the ground. With the Red Army occupying much of Eastern Europe, there was little the United States or Britain could do to challenge Soviet control without risking another major war. Stalin's vision for Eastern Europe was driven less by democracy than by security. Determined to prevent another invasion, he created a buffer zone of Soviet-aligned communist governments under Moscow's control. As communist parties eliminated opposition and manipulated elections, hopes for democracy disappeared. For many Eastern Europeans, liberation from Nazi rule was followed by Soviet domination. With Eastern Europe firmly slipping into Moscow's orbit, the eyes of the world turned to the heart of the continent, a shattered, defeated Germany. In the aftermath of World War II, the Allies agreed on a broad plan to transform Germany. The country would be disarmed, democratized, and economically rebuilt to prevent future aggression and promote stability. These efforts were intended to lay the foundation for a peaceful, democratic Germany that could eventually be reunified under a single national government. Yet this vision quickly collapsed as tensions between the Allies grew. Instead of being governed as a single unit, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, each controlled by one of the victorious powers. To complicate matters further, Berlin was also divided into 4 sectors, even though it lay deep within the Soviet occupation zone. This arrangement turned the city into a flashpoint of Cold War tensions and a potential source of conflict between the former Allies. By 1946, hopes for a reunified Germany had largely collapsed. In the Soviet occupation zone, Stalin's government suppressed political opposition and established a communist regime loyal to Moscow. Rather than serving as a temporary step toward reunification, East Germany became a Soviet-controlled satellite state on the front line of a divided Europe. As Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control and Germany hardened into opposing zones, the reality of a divided continent became undeniable. Yet for many in the West, the illusion of wartime unity lingered until a singular moment cut through the silence. On March 5, 1946, Winston Churchill warned that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, dividing the continent into a Soviet-dominated communist East and a democratic capitalist West. His speech captured the growing reality of post-war Europe and became one of the defining statements of the emerging Cold War, signaling that a new era of conflict between former allies had already begun. By 1948, Berlin had become a fragile outpost of Western influence deep inside Soviet-controlled territory. Seeking to force the Western allies out of the city, Stalin cut off all rail, road, and canal access to West Berlin in June 1948, setting the stage for the first major confrontation of the Cold War. The objective was brutally simple: starve the 2 million residents of West Berlin, isolate the Western garrisons, and force the United States, Britain, and France to abandon the city entirely. Stalin gambled that the Allies would rather surrender their foothold in Berlin than risk another world war. Faced with an impossible choice between military confrontation and a humiliating retreat, the Western Allies chose a third path. They decided to supply an entire metropolis exclusively from the air, an unprecedented logistical feat known as Operation Vittles. The Allied response was the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year, American and British aircraft flew food, fuel, medicine, and other vital supplies into West Berlin around the clock. At its peak, a plane landed every few minutes. Unable to stop the airlift without risking war, Stalin lifted the blockade in May 1949, giving the West a major early victory in the Cold War. The Western Allies had held the line without firing a single shot. The Berlin Airlift proved that the Cold War would not just be fought with words or treaties, but through sheer logistical power, unbreakable strategic will, and the refusal to back down in the face of totalitarian pressure. The end of the Berlin Blockade confirmed that the wartime alliance had broken down. As temporary occupation zones became permanent borders, Germany was formally divided. In 1949, the Western zones united to form West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, while the Soviet zone became East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, cementing the political and ideological division of Europe for decades to come. At the center of this division stood Berlin. Although located deep within East Germany, the city remained split between East and West. West Berlin became a democratic, capitalist enclave surrounded by communist territory, while East Berlin served as the capital of East Germany. More than just a divided city, Berlin became the most visible symbol of the Cold War and the front line between two rival superpowers. As World War II ended and Cold War tensions began to emerge, the Allied powers created the United Nations, UN, in October 1945. Designed to succeed where the League of Nations had failed, the UN aimed to provide a forum for international cooperation and help prevent future global conflicts. To balance global representation with realpolitik power, the UN was structured around two primary bodies. 1. The General Assembly, the democratic heart of the organization. Every recognized member nation, regardless of size or wealth, was granted a seat and an equal vote. It served as a global town hall for discussion, policy recommendations, and international debate. 2. The Security Council, the executive muscle of the UN, tasked with maintaining global peace and security. Unlike the General Assembly, the Security Council was given the power to enforce decisions, impose sanctions, and authorize military action. The core of this structure was the Permanent Five, P5, comprised of the primary victors of World War II, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, USSR, France, and China. These five nations held permanent seats on the Council, reflecting their dominant geopolitical influence in the post-war era. Alongside the P5 were the rotating members, a select group of additional nations elected for limited terms. This secondary tier was created to ensure that smaller countries and diverse geographic regions were granted a voice in high-level peacekeeping decisions. The true key to the Security Council's power, and its ultimate Achilles heel, was the concept of unanimity. To ensure that no major superpower could be forced into a war by the others, each of the five permanent members was granted absolute veto power. While the veto kept the superpowers at the negotiating table, it meant that any single permanent member could instantly block any resolution, statement, or military intervention that ran counter to its strategic interests. As the ideological rift between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union deepened, the Security Council quickly became another battleground. The very unanimity required to keep the global peace was routinely shattered by the emerging Cold War rivalry, often rendering the UN paralyzed precisely when the world needed it most. Between 1946 and 1964, the USSR used its veto 103 times, compared to 4 or fewer vetoes by the other permanent members combined. This paralyzed many UN initiatives and revealed how deeply divided the post-war world had become. By the close of the 1940s, the dust of World War II had settled, only to reveal a stark, unforgiving global landscape. What began as fragile wartime cooperation between ideological opposites had completely dissolved, solidifying into an era defined by perpetual tension. By the end of the decade, the brief window of post-war optimism had officially slammed shut, replaced by a cold, hardened international landscape defined by 4 inescapable realities. The first was the subjugation of Eastern Europe. From Poland to Bulgaria, sovereign nations were systematically transformed into satellite states, locked tightly within Moscow's sphere of influence through puppet regimes, political purges, and the constant threat of the Red Army. Second was the reality of a fractured Germany. The original dream of a unified democratic nation was dead, replaced by two distinct states, the capitalist Federal Republic in the west and the Communist Democratic Republic in the east, facing off across a hostile border that sliced directly through the heart of Berlin. Third, the United Nations stood hamstrung. Designed to preserve global peace, the newly formed UN Security Council quickly found itself locked in perpetual deadlock, its executive power routinely paralyzed by the strategic flash of the superpower veto. Finally, the Iron Curtain had turned to concrete. Winston Churchill's early warning had fully materialized into a physical and ideological reality, where the division between East and West was no longer an abstract political concept, but a line enforced by barbed wire, guard towers, and irreconcilable worldviews. The Cold War was no longer a looming possibility. It was the defining dynamic of international politics. Deeply rooted in irreconcilable ideological visions, fierce national security anxieties, and bitter wartime grievances, this quiet yet dangerous struggle had taken full hold of the planet. The stage was set. For the next 4 decades, this confrontation would dictate world politics, spark proxy wars across the globe, shape the fortunes of nations, and hold humanity in the shadow of potential nuclear annihilation.